Hello, Accounting 1. Today we are going to go over closing entries. The last 2 weeks we went over adjusting entries. Adjusting entries and closing entries are similar in that they're done at the end of an accounting period. However, adjusting entries are completed first. So now we are going to go over closing entries. We're at the very end of the accounting cycle. So, closing entries, whenever you think of those entries, I want you to think of the color red. Okay, so think of the color red. When you think of the color red, then you're going to relate the R to revenue. You're going to relate the E to expenses. You're going to relate the D to dividends. Well, I just went over the 3 temporary accounts. Temporary accounts are used for one accounting period. And then at the end of that accounting period, they get closed to 0. They do not carry a balance from period to period. Permanent accounts, on the other hand, carry a balance from period to period. So let me give you an example of the adjustment for depreciation. What's that entry? Okay, you debit depreciation expense, that's an expense, and then you credit accumulated depreciation, that's a contra asset. The depreciation expense is classified as an expense, which means that will be a temporary account. It's going to get closed to 0. The accumulated depreciation is a contra asset, which means that's a permanent account. It will carry a balance from period to period. So, only know the temporary accounts. Just like when I taught you debit and credit. When I taught you an easy way, I said only know the increase side because the other side is always the opposite. Well, I'm about to teach you an easy way to remember temporary account, temporary or permanent. Only know the temporary. Guess what? There's only 3 different categories. There's red, revenue, expenses, and dividends. So if it's not temporary, it will be permanent. Okay? So remember that. Permanent accounts do not get close to 0. They carry a balance from year to year. Temporary accounts get closed to 0. So what I'd like for you to do is print out from Blackboard this trial balance. This is an example of an adjusted trial balance, and I'm going to show you how to complete journal entries from this trial balance. Okay? And you'll work similarly, in the lab. Okay, so we're going to go in order. So let me go over here, and I'm going to put number 1. Okay, so number 1, we will close the R in red first. So we're looking for only revenue accounts. I go down my trial balance, and I see sales. That's a revenue account. I also see interest revenue. That's a revenue account as well. You might see other revenue. Well, that's a revenue account. So you want to close those 2 accounts. All right, so let's go slowly. We're going to do the opposite of what we normally do. Okay, so the normal balance for revenue is a credit. When I close it to 0, I'm going to do the opposite, so I will debit revenue. The normal balance for expenses is a debit. When I close it to 0, I'm going to do the opposite, so I will credit expenses. Dividends, it's a contra equity. The normal balance is a debit. When I close it to 0, I will credit the dividends account. All these accounts will get closed to the retained earnings account. And then afterwards, we're going to post. All right, so we're going to go over to the board, and I'm going to debit sales. And I just work right from the trial balance, and I have 80,000. Next, I am going to close interest revenue. So I debit interest revenue. that is $3,000. And then I indent and I'm going to credit retained earnings. $83,000. Okay, that is your first closing entry. Now I'm going to close the E in the red. All expense accounts. Well, I see cost of goods sold first. This is number 2. I debit cost of goods sold, and that is debited for $25,000. Whoops, sorry. Guess what? Just kidding, seeing if you're paying attention. I'm closing my expenses to 0, so I want to do the opposite of what I normally would do. So I am going to debit retained earnings. And I'll figure out the total in a minute. So let me go slow. So now I'm going to credit cost of goods sold, credit, because I want to zero that out. And that is $25,000. And then I'm going to credit rent expense, $1,000. And then I'm going to credit salaries expense, credit because I'm zeroing that out. And then I'm going to credit depreciation expense, $7,000. Okay, then I add up all my expenses. Okay, in your calculator, add those all up. And it's going to be a debit of $36,500 when you total all those expenses. Now I'm going to close the D in my red. Well, the D stands for dividends. For my example, there is only one dividends. I'm going to do the opposite of what I normally do. So I'm going to debit retained earnings. $1,500, and I'm going to credit dividends. When I do that, that will zero out my dividends account. This problem that you're going to see similar in the lab is going to ask you to compute net income. Now, it's not looking for a formal income statement. So just figure out the total revenue. Well, you've got 80,000 plus 3, so that's 83,000. And then subtract your total expenses. Well, I can work right from my closing, so I totaled expenses. All of them totaled $36,500. And that equals net income of $46,500. Okay, that's the net income. Okay, I'm going to erase now, and I'm going to show you how to post. So let's erase. And we had all those entries. Remember all those entries. I'm hoping you're working with me, right? Because now we're going to post those entries. Okay, so now I have a T account, okay, and it is called retained earnings. Okay, so you look at the trial balance, and in the trial balance, there is a balance for retained earnings. Well, that's a beginning balance. This is December 31st, 2022. So the beginning balance would have ended December 31st, 2021. So I put December 31st, 2021. What's the beginning balance is $23,800. Okay, now I'm going to post my balances for my entries. Okay, so I look at my closing entries, my first closing entries. What did I do to the retained earnings account? I credited for $83,000. So I put in a credit for $83,000. Okay, and then kind of check it off. That's the first one. The second one, I debited retained earnings for all the expenses. That totaled $36,500. So I have a debit for $36,500. Okay. My third closing entry, I debited retained earnings for $1,500. That was closing my dividends. Well, now I'm going to figure the final balance. Okay. So remember, sometimes it's easier with cheap calculators. Add up your positives first. So 23,800 plus 83,000. Okay, get a total. And then add up your expenses. 36,500 plus 1,500. And then take the difference between the two. So this is kind of like a checking account. Think of your checking account. The final balance will be the normal balance. The normal balance of retained earnings is a credit. And the date would be December 31st, 2022. For this particular example, you've just put in 68,800. Okay? And that's what you will do for closing entries. Okay, so get right into the lab. Do not wait. Have a good week.